and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing you a beautiful multi-layer Valentine featuring Papertrey Ink's Rustic Wood Star. I'm calling this part 2 because I did share on my community page that I do have a blog post with this card using the same die set. This was more of a farmhouse style and I wanted to show the versatility. One of the things that I'm really looking forward to this year is using the products in my stash multiple times. Here's a look at the die set. As you can see, it's packed full of beautiful pieces. There are 3 layers to the bow, a large and small wreath, some foliage, a star, and then those slats at the bottom, those dies at the bottom, those will create a second star. I did die cut the wreaths 3 times, 3 of the large, 3 of the small, using Canson XL watercolor paper. I'm going to use my Distress Oxide sprays. The first one that I added was Sponge Sugar. The second one is going to be Kitsch Flamingo. You'll notice as I'm pulling them out to show you that I am shaking them up well. I shake them from side to side to get that pigment moving. There is a ball inside of it, and once that ball is moving freely, you can tell that the pigment is mixed up well. This third color is going to be Festive Berry, and I'm going to splatter this onto the wreaths. So I'm just going to use the nozzle once I get the pigment mixed up, and I'll tap it on. I am using my spray box to make sure that I don't get anything over my desk. I tend to make a big mess when I do any type of splattering and spraying, so this box has been very helpful to me. Once I get this on, I will again use my heat tool to dry it. So in between each of the layers, I did leave in that I use my Ranger heat tool to dry between the layers. Once I get this layer dry, I will come in with some water. So at first I'm going to put it in my hand and do some clapping over the top, and then I want that red to move just a little bit more, and I end up spraying or spritzing each of the wreaths with the water, and then I will dry it and set those aside. I'll start moving on to my sentiment, and I did stamp a sentiment on the inside of my card that I'll talk about in a little bit. But for the outside, I wanted to use this Botanical Letters die and stamp set. This again is from Papertrey Ink. It's no longer available, but there is one available from the Greetery that's very similar, and so I will link that in the description box below. This die set does come, I left all of my dies together, as you can see, and I just cut out one large alphabet to make sure that I have one of each letter, and then I use the stamps to fit inside of the negative spaces. Once I get them aligned, then I close the door of my MISTI and I'll insert the die cuts, and I have die cut the word you. I want the sentiment to be bold, and I'm going to stamp with VersaFine Black Onyx ink to make sure that I get a really nice impression on the first try. I'm only going to share the stamping of the Y with you today, just for the sake of time. I will admit that this does take a little bit of time getting everything perfectly aligned, especially when we get to the flower part. There are 3 layers to the flower. I'm only going to use 2. You can see that there is a key so that you can look and see which direction the flowers are going. For the first layer, I'm going to align my leaves, and for the leaves I will be using Pink Fresh Studios Fresh Pear, and I use the same colors on all 3 letters. So this is the same process for the O and for the U. Once I get this stamped down, I will bring in the flower, and for the flower I'm going to use Berrylicious, again from Pink Fresh Studio. I wanted to bring in a pop of red to these alphas because the background paper that I'm going to be using is going to be red, and so I wanted to make sure that the center portion of my card had those touches of red in it, because I did go with more of a pink tone when I colored my wreaths. And I'm looking for that Berrylicious, and once I get it, there it is, I'll put my Y back in, ink up my flowers, and then we can move on. If you're wondering what I'm stamping with over the top of my Misty, Sabrina over at Scrappy Tail Crafts gave each of her designers at the end of the year for Christmas this wonderful, I guess it's a stamping weight that has your name on it for each of the designers, and I absolutely love it because it really is helping with the additional pressure on my Misty. I colored up this piece of cardstock using the Berrylicious again, and then I'm just drying it in between. I have this Distressed Dots from Rubbernecker. This is one of my favorite stamps that I purchased last year. And I'm going to ink it up and do tone on tone. So the reason that I brought my heat tool to my ink blended panel was just to dry it a little bit, and I think that it really helps with that tone on tone to get a deeper tone. I went horizontally on this because I thought that it would be a little bit easier to align this way. The center line is not going to bother me because I am going to use those bow dies, and I'll be able to maneuver around it so that you won't see that seam. I did put a little bit of adhesive on the back of this, and so that's why it was difficult to pull it up. But now I'm going to lay out my dies. I want the largest one to be with the darker red that was on the bottom portion of that inking, and I did the other two pieces from the top half. Here I'm adding a little bit of dimension between the two layers. As I mentioned, this is a 3-layer bow, and I love dimension. I think it adds so much to a card. Once I get this little dot from scrapbook.com added to the bottom layer, I will align the top layer, and then I'm going to set it aside. I want to add a little bit more dimension to this without adding any more foam tape, and so that third layer falls flat, and I'm going to add a little bit of Copic marker to it to add a little more definition, and that will really help that top layer pop. This is a stencil from Papertrey Ink, and I do have a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock that I've cut down. I'm going to do some die cutting. I'm going to die cut 3 layers, and I'll be using the Anna Griffin Slimline Compendium dies. So I cut, my largest layer is going to be white, my medium layer will be red, and then this will be the smallest layer, and this is where my wreaths are going to land. I'm being very light-handed with this Berrylicious. I aligned that stencil towards the center, and I'm going to do my best to use those lines at the very top to kind of realign the bottom portion. I'm not too concerned about this because I will bring in a 4th layer from that Slimline Compendium, and it's going to be vellum, so it will go over the top of this. But you'll notice that the bottom portion, because I added ink to my brush, was a little bit more of a deeper red, and that's going to really bother me. So I'm going to realign that stencil over the top, and I'm going to add a little bit darker red to that top portion of this. But first I wanted to add a little bit of pink to go with the wreaths. So this is going to tie in with my wreaths. It's the only other pink that I'm going to have on the card. This is Ballet Slippers from Pink Fresh Studio. Because I'm going over the entire panel, I'm using my larger brushes, and that just helps me get a little bit more of an even application when I'm putting it on. So here's where I'm going to realign this, and I'm just going to be a little bit more heavy-handed with that Berrylicious, and I'll like the way that the tones match a little bit better. But as I mentioned, I do end up cutting a fourth using a fourth die, and it's going to be the same size die that I'm using on this. So you'll see these Compendium dies. Actually, you'll see just one of them. And there it is. I'll cut a second one using a heavy vellum. I have a 4x9 side folding slimline card, and I've added some bitty big paper. This is from Papertrey Ink. These are packs of paper that come with polka dots, large and small, and then stripes vertical or thicker stripes and thinner stripes. And so I used the red thin striped bitty big paper from Papertrey Ink. Again, I'll link that. And now you can see the other layers that I die cut using that Slimline Compendium from Griffin. I'm not adding any dimension to any of these layers. I'm just gluing one on top of the other, but adding that interest with the stencil, putting the vellum over the top is just going to break it up from my wreaths. It was a little bit too bold when I had the wreaths. It was competing with the colors on the wreaths, and so I added that vellum and it softened everything up. As I mentioned, I have large and small wreaths, and I'm aligning the small wreath on top of the large one to give it a little bit more fullness. And then I'll add these little foam dots to each of them, and that will allow each of those wreaths to just have a little bit of dimension. You could put the foam tape in between each layer of the wreath as well, and that would give you a different look of dimension, but I wanted each of them just to stand up just a little bit more. I'm trying to figure out how I need these aligned. I'll get the next two on, and then I'll realign the top one. I thought I might hang the bow towards the top of the card, but in the end I ended up adding it directly to the wreath. I think that it just fit a little bit better with the card, and I liked the way that it looked. It just kind of has an odd look when it's away from it, because in my mind I was thinking that there was a ribbon at the top and it was holding all three wreaths as they were hanging, but yeah, I didn't like the look of it. There I just added a little bit more glue to the vellum. I needed to know where my wreaths were going to be before I adhered that bottom portion of the vellum down, making sure that I was able to conceal that liquid glue. And now I'm going to start adding my letters. So I've adhered my bow to the top of the wreath, and I thought that the Y looked much better on top of the bow as opposed to underneath the bow. And I'll add the other three letters, and then I want to add that Valentine feel to the card. So there is an older Papertrey Ink stamp and die set called You Make My Heart Soar, and it had a die that had all of these tiny hearts, which were absolutely perfect for my card. I'm going to lay these out onto my wreaths. Again, it's going to break up that pink, add a little bit more of that red into the top of the card so that all of the layers are just flowing together nicely. And I like adding lots of layers. I like the way that the stenciling really adds just a little bit of interest underneath my wreaths. The striped paper adds that bold red and white, and then of course I have the other two layers that kind of break up each of the patterns between the top stenciled layer and the bottom striped layer. On the inside of my card, I did stamp a sentiment that says make my heart soar. So on the outside of the card it says you, and on the inside it says make my heart soar, and I liked that sentiment for this Valentine. As I talked about, I want to add dimension with that Copic marker, so I believe it's an R39, and I went kind of in a C curve around where the knot of the bow would be, and then I added just a few flicking motions on the left and the right side, and you can see that it really helps that top layer of the bow stand out just a little bit more. I'm going to show you a couple of close-ups, and that will finish my Valentine card for today. If you want to see the other Rustic Wood Star card and how I created that, head over to my blog. That will be linked below. Thank you so much for joining me, and until next time, have a fabulous day.